Oral tradition. In the latter part of the 19th century in Germany, however, it was seen that there are stories or units of material which sometimes appear in quite different places in the more or less common synoptic outline. This is especially true of passages that are found only in Matthew and Luke. So a theory of units of material was developed by which these materials were explained as floating, orally developed units of tradition. An example of a floating unit of tradition is the passage in which Jesus speaks about how God takes care of the birds of the heavens and the grass of the field. Matthew 60:25-34, Luke 12:22-31. In Matthew, this passage is found in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's chapter 6. In Luke, it is found in his chapter 12, and it is not found in Mark at all. The story is a complete block, which shows apparently that it and others like it each formed a unit of material or story section that has been preserved by oral tradition. It then was suggested that these units existed independently and that they were taught as separate stories in Greek-speaking Christian communities by about 70-80 AD. Additionally, scholars assumed that in their original form these units were well preserved and authentic, but over a period of time after 1900 in Germany especially, there arose serious questions concerning the authenticity of these units. It was postulated that these floating oral stories were not connected originally, but were placed together by Mark, assumed to be the first gospel writer, and also by an unknown writer of a hypothetical document called Q, which Matthew and Luke quoted often. Scholars maintained that these oral stories should be understood as having been developed in the teaching context of the early church. They concluded, therefore, that a lot of these stories do not really go back to Jesus, but are simply the form in which the traditions of Jesus were being taught in Greek churches about 50 years after his time. Thus, it was suggested that if Matthew gives a unit found also in Luke, but opens his story with words very unlike those found in Luke, one can assume that Matthew is taking the same unit known to Luke, but independently giving it a new context. Consequently, it is argued that if Matthew, Mark, and Luke could treat these units in such a fashion, one may suppose that each story developed from some early memory and was taught with all kinds of interpretations and additions to what may have been the original story. Today, scholars who accept the oral hypothesis have become more and more skeptical about the reliability of the gospel materials. Oral tradition can develop, however, in both literate and pre-literate or largely non-literate societies. The development of Jewish tradition reflected in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, involved the text being written and then memorized and interpreted. Therefore, the text preceded the oral tradition that developed around the text. Even rabbinic oral traditions were written down, sometimes as notes, very early. In ancient Greece, oral traditions developed from stories told by bards, which were later put in writing by poets like Homer. Early in the 20th century, scholars like Julius Wellhausen, a German Old Testament scholar, suggested that this was the way the gospel materials developed. I would reiterate that both the attempt to harmonize the gospels and the tenets of the oral hypothesis theory are misleading. The very fact that we can combine synoptic gospel passages and discover excellent longer stories means that our units have been deliberately separated from earlier contexts, but are still so well preserved that we often can put them back together simply by placing them according to their mutual elements of common theme and congruency. This means that back of our synoptic gospels lies a firm written tradition, and any problems we face with the text must inevitably be solved by careful literary analysis.